Hey guys, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study. Thanks for joining me. We're continuing in Biblical Theology 1. We're looking at nations. That's our subject right now. For those of you who have read the Psalms, you've read this verse. You've also read other verses like it. Like in Psalm 24, I think it starts the first verse with the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Here we have at the end of Psalm 82, Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit all nations. Before I read my notes here, because they are kind of pointed, I want to give a quick reason for the pointedness. With a verse like this, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit the nations." For we who say that we believe the Bible, if we believe that verse, that God shall inherit all nations, there's a certain way in which we're going to perceive the nations. There's a certain way in which we're going to consider our purpose towards our own nation. So with that being said, though many or most of us have read this verse or other verses like it, we continue to allow the nations to indulge in their own pride and the arrogance apart from God. Because of our disbelief in this verse, in verses like it, because we don't believe that the Lord shall inherit all nations. We have not challenged our nation's hostility toward God or the beauty of holiness. Instead, we allow them to continue in their hostility until it comes knocking at our door. That same mentality killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Here's what I'm getting at. Here's what I want to say. When you read the book that I'm following along with, this all kind of makes a little bit more sense as to what I'm getting at. But for this video, what I want to use as an introduction here, the nations have a hostility towards God. The first mention of the nations, we went through this in the last video, the first mention of the nations is when they all come together in the plains of Shinar to build a tower that's going to rival the heavens. From that very inception, there has been a stream of hostility from the nations towards God. And there are roots in that hostility that go deeper than just the political agenda. However, when we even just take simply that the nations themselves don't consider God at all, this in itself is very much a detrimental statement to all nations. I'm convinced that much of culture does not come from above. By culture, I don't mean like your literacy and how many books and novels you've read, whether you know science and philosophy and other intellectual things. That's not what I'm talking about with culture. It's not about being a man of culture. It's about the societal mindset, the way that our culture, the way that our general society thinks and lives and moves and has its being from. Many nations are hostile to God in that Christianity is being opposed or persecuted, or both, with more and more ferocity. In these Western countries, which I'm from, and I'm assuming that you're probably also from, but probably not all of you, we find the more subtle and therefore more dangerous persecution. Here's what's going on in the West. We are permitted a Sunday culture, a few hours to spend together at church. We can have our little Wednesday Bible studies, and we can have our times where we meet together and we talk to each other. But when our Christianity goes beyond the bounds of whatever church-related events that we're doing, and goes into things like the workplace, or the media, or government policies and laws, or education, or our opinions on gender and sexuality, when it crosses those bounds, now we're going into forbidden zones. We're forbidden to allow such a Sunday culture, such a Christianity, such our own opinions and thoughts to come into the secular affairs of men. And this is made evident in many realms, but one specifically we can use. Scientists are absolutely appalled, and they're even angered that anyone would take the Bible as literal and base their science off of it. There's this creation evolution debate, and I mean, for most scientists, it's already settled. There is no debate here. Our mere insistence on taking the Bible literally seems to cause for chafing an argument. If we would consider to teach our children that there's more than one option. You don't have to believe in evolution. You don't have to believe in Darwinian evolution specifically, even to even claim that there's an intelligent designer. You don't even have to go as far as young earth creationism. Just there's an intelligent designer. That statement in itself is so detrimental to what the scientist believes to be truth that they oppose it with everything in them. You cannot teach your kids, and you cannot argue that the public school should teach kids that there's more than one opinion. Freedom of belief, let alone freedom of speech, is gladly tossed out the window because this kind of belief is deemed, quote, dangerous. Unless you convince your children that science declares there is no God, which it doesn't, by the way, but unless it says this is what the scientist says, unless you convince your children that science declares there is no God, then your children will be scientifically illiterate and will not understand the world around them. It's an utterly false statement, and yet this is what the scientists in the scientific community are trying to promote. It is just as much a sin for the nations and cultures to continue in their ignorance and rejection of God as it is for individuals. What I'm getting at here, because nations are the inheritance of God, because he shall rule over all nations, because the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the nations are the Lord's and the fullness thereof, I think is one version. Because of this, if we take those verses seriously, and we take those concepts seriously, that God will rule over all nations, then a nation is held just as accountable before God as a nation, as an individual is. The gospel is just as much to the nations as it is to individuals. The nations are the Lord's inheritance. This is a Hebraic view, and therefore a prophetic understanding that would grasp this. I mentioned in a previous video, somewhere towards the beginning, I went through kind of that Hebraic mindset and how oftentimes we're all too Greek, and even Messianic Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism have inherited this Babylonian, this Greek mindset. They have not continued in the Hebraic understanding. But it takes a prophetic or an apostolic kind of disposition to be able to see past just simply, well, the nations need to be held to a moral standard. Well, it's not just that they need to be held to a moral standard. There's a purpose that God has created for these nations. There is something that God has revealed himself to these nations in certain ways, that if they reject that, they reject everything. They are the Lord's inheritance, and they need to know that. If we as the church, the sole instrument of God that knows the truth, if we do not take this reality and truth and this heavenly perspective to the nations, then how are they going to hear it? This is Acts 17, Paul on Mars Hill. I want to read this to you. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, "You men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For as I passed by and I beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Whom, therefore, you ignorantly worship, him I declare to you. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything. Seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him." Another translation, that haply they might be found of him, and find him, and though he not be far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. In the times of ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a way. He appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. I want you to notice this here, this last portion in the last slide. and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. God apparently has established which nations will be during what times of history, the rise and fall of nations, has determined the times before appointed, and he's also even determined the boundaries. This is the message that Paul gave to secular men on Mars Hill. Although the Greeks emphasized and applauded man in all that he is, Paul brings an entirely different view. The Greeks actually even had this weird worship of the male body. When you worked out in the gymnasium, this is also where you were to get your education. When you worked out in the gymnasium, you would work out in the nude. They had this weird fascination with the male body. They emphasized and applauded man and all that he is. But Paul brings an entirely different view. Mankind has always built monuments and massive architecture to their gods. It goes back to the wisdom of the principalities. They need something massive. They need something monumental. If it isn't large, then it isn't great. This is the wisdom of the principalities. And it's reflected through the way that humanity thinks of if it's God, certainly they need this huge doorway, otherwise they can't fit through, right? And if it's God, obviously they're powerful beyond what we can comprehend, so we need to show that power and that splendor and all of the glory and everything that we conceive this God would be in our working. This is the thinking that categorizes mankind. Unless we achieve greatness as human beings, we aren't successful. And of course, greatness has been defined as wealth, fame, stature, these sorts of things. In order to continue in that view, humanity as well as nations must say that God has not made them. Why? If they declare that they themselves have made themselves, they themselves have pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps and have gotten to this point, then they're the ones who get to determine their own destiny. They're the ones who get to determine their own purpose, what it is that they want to do. But if God has formed them, well, then maybe God has a reason for forming them. Do you see what I'm getting at? God has established the church in Israel and therefore decides their ultimate purpose. Paul interjects, though, that God has also established the nations and their boundaries. Excuse me for a minute. Excuse me. Pardon me. Therefore, God is the authority over all nations because he's established them. This isn't a matter of you own what you create. This isn't what I'm getting at. This is something altogether different. This is because God has given these things purpose. He's the one who decides what their boundaries are going to be and what they need in order to fulfill that purpose. And vice versa. Though they currently perform their own purposes, that does not relinquish them from God's cosmic purpose for them. If God establishes the boundaries of the nations, then why do the nations war against one another for more territory? The notion of a boundary being a limitation is rampant in the history of nations. And often the believers also agree to this idea of a boundary. Think of even for those of you who are in the United States, think of even our own history here. How is it that we got from sea to shining sea? Did we have California when we first had our settlers come over here? No. In fact, this is why that northeastern coast is so heavily populated. That's the first places that people were landing, is that east coast. You have you have the taking over of the Native Americans' land. Why is it that America decided that that's the way that they were going to be established? What if God had purposed that we would have this territory of land, but if we would have trusted him, he would have given it to us and the natives would have been able to be peacefully among us instead of always warring against us and being defined as savages by most of the whites, especially even in the textbooks today. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. Is it possible? And the pressing issue of the boundary is God's purpose for that nation. But we think that God is giving a boundary as a limitation, and we hate limitations. This is also why we think the law is oppressive, because for God to say you cannot eat these foods, that's a limitation in our diet, and we despise it. We don't realize if God gives a limitation, it is for our benefit. Do you get what I'm getting at here? Does the nation's purpose warrant their size? And if so, then why do the nations desire more land, more representation, and more might, meaning more power, more prowess? I might be willing to bet, or I would be willing to bet that these purposes that God has given do not benefit the nation itself, but rather another nation, or even God alone. But we don't want to think of it as God's purposes benefit something else other than ourselves. And that's why we have a lot of weird theological views that don't make sense, just to be honest. Just as the church is called to something outside of itself, so too are the nations called to something outside of themselves. Yet, we in Christendom often mimic their mindset. We don't mind outreach and planning events that will benefit the community because it often revolves around our own church buildings and our own reputation in that community. With both churchianity and nations, it is entirely a numbers game, and it has nothing to do with God, even though you might pay homage to God. If it's all about your building, if it's all about your reputation, if it's all about getting numbers to come to you, if it's all about what you're doing, then it has nothing to do with the will of God. God's purpose for the church, we've already gone through this, right? When we went through the principalities and powers, God's purpose for the church is for something outside of the church. We are to demonstrate to the principalities and powers the wisdom of God. We are to drive the Jew to jealousy. These are what we've been called to. The nations are the Lord's inheritance. It is time for them to start acting like it. But how can they act like it unless they know it? And how can one go and teach them and preach to them unless they're sent? And how can one be sent? I'm going to add this. How can one be sent if they themselves have not stood before God and His counsel and listened? It is time for we, the church, to start believing it. And believe you me, that our believing of that statement will not lead to a seven mountain teaching. It will not lead to some dominionist theology. It will not lead to us thinking, well, if only we can get more Christians in these places, then all things are going to work out. No, we have to understand politics itself, whether it's capitalism or communism, they're both the same wisdom, just two different expressions of it. They're both the same fallen political system. Do you understand? There's one way, and it is through God's wisdom. It's through theocracy. This is the way. Walk ye in it. God's call is much more profound. So in this verse in Psalm 82, this last verse of Psalm 82, and the passage in Acts, and there's a few other verses in the Old Testament where God shows jealousy for His name among the nations. I started to come to the belief, I started to realize that God does not only desire that the individuals seek Him, but also the nations. So like, when I came to Christ, I was taught that God has jealousy for people, and so He loves people. We need to go out and we need to talk to people. We need to try to win the world to Christ. But I didn't realize that God actually cares about the nations as well. There's an individual call to each person, but there's a much larger call to even the nations. God has established them, and even all the way through Revelation 22, when we're seeing heaven, the nations still exist. God is jealous for the nations just as much as He is jealous for the individuals. This is an important thing to understand, and not just to believe, but to really have it like sink in and to weigh out, if this is true, what are the implications? The void of seeking pardon me as I fix the slide here. The void of seeking God and His purposes, in the void of seeking God and His purposes, a nation is driven to its ultimate end, wickedness and destruction. War, rumors of war, devastation, genocide, abortion, and all mechanisms of mass extermination are enforced by governments. It is not the individuals within the nation to perform such atrocities, but the individual paying homage to his country, and therefore obeying his government's commands, led by demons that will execute such atrocity, such anathema, such abomination. Here's what I'm trying to get at. We discussed when looking at the principalities and powers, human wickedness is not a matter of depravity alone, but that there are these demonic forces that usurp, manipulate, coerce people through a wisdom that is fallen. Okay, are you following me? So if that's true for nations, the people who have a patriotism to that nation, a blind patriotism even, they're going to follow their nation wherever their nation tells them to go, and they're going to execute horrible things in the name of patriotism. This is what you can say happened with Joseph Mengele, since I brought him up in the previous videos. You can say this is what happened with him. He had a patriotism towards Germany, and specifically towards Nazi Germany. And because he had that kind of a disposition towards the state, he was able to justify in his own heart and in his own mind that he was doing nothing wrong. But he was doing something wrong. God tells Abraham in Genesis 15 that his descendants will suffer slavery and persecution in another country. The reason is given in verse 16, so Genesis 15:16. It's because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Catch that. God was going to destroy the Amorites for their wickedness, but it had not yet reached the brim. Therefore, God allowed the slavery and persecution of his own people for 400 years, so that there would come a time later when Israel would bring justice to the land. Did you catch that? Is your mind blown when you think of that? Consider that. I mean, seriously, stop and think about it. God allowed the suffering of his own people so that the wicked could continue in their wickedness until it reached the full measure. We can put it another way. God allowed the suffering of his own son. Is that not what he calls Israel? Israel's my son, my firstborn son. Exodus 4:22. He allowed the suffering of his own son so that those who are wicked might have a chance to repent. And when the time came that there was no longer any possibility that they were going to repent, their wickedness has reached a full measure to the point where now the only reasonable way for God to address this is to drive them out of the land. It's to destroy them utterly. Do you get what I'm saying? This is craziness. Behold the goodness and severity of God, for the judgment must begin at the household of God. And I dare you, go back to 1 Peter 4 and read the context of that statement. We like to pull that one verse out of context. For judgment must begin at the household of God, but the whole context is Christian persecution. God is allowing Christian persecution because judgment must begin at the household of God. This is the whole point of the Amorites. Their wickedness must reach full measure. Even in modern history, Germany's fall after Hitler was not their eradication. When you trace their history back, you will find that the name Germany comes from the settlers of that region. That region of Rome was Gemaria. Those settlers were Assyrians. We can say that Assyria's cup has not been filled. I mentioned in passing that the nations are displayed in Revelation 21 and 22. The bride rules and reigns with Christ in heaven. But the question can be raised, what is there to rule over in heaven? Haven't all things been brought underneath the authority of Jesus? Haven't all people been made clean so that there is no more sin and death? God has plans and purposes for the nations, that even kings are mentioned to come up to that city and to take of the fruit and the leaves of the tree of life, that they might find healing. If those nations will seek God to understand his plans and purposes, then they shall receive reward as nations. When we as believers surrendered our lives, purposes, and ambitions to God's plans, we were the beneficiaries of peace and joy. So too shall they receive. What are God's plans and purposes for the nations? Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. I used to think that when Paul said that they should happily feel after him, that the they meant people, but the problem with this in Acts 17, when you go to the context, is a continuation of the sentence speaking of the nations and their boundaries. It's the same sentence here. If Paul is continuing the statement about nations, then the they mentioned must be a national they. The nations might seek the Lord if haply they should find him. Therefore, the following statement of judgment is not only directed upon individuals, but upon nations as well. We can look at Joel 3:2. I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. From the context surrounding this verse, this is after Jesus has returned. In fact, Jesus even makes reference to this verse in Matthew 25:31, when he states that when the Son of Man comes, that he shall separate all nations like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. While we, as the people of God, are remaining in the nations, we have a very specific role to play to those nations. How often have you heard that spoken? The reality is that we haven't even considered the God that God has purposed for us in our own nations. Even the most charismatic congregations that believe we're going to move nations for God have blatantly ignored what I'm contending for here. We as God's people are to seek the Lord, to comprehend the intention of God for our nations, and to then hold our nations accountable. Why did God establish Greece? That it might seek him if haply Greece would be found of him. To seek God and to find God reveals his purposes. You don't need to tell a newly saved person to go tell their friends about Jesus. They probably already done that. For the nations to seek God, and as a nation to be found of God, his heart and his purpose will be revealed in a manner to express his intention for that nation. There are a lot of people that I've heard give stories of when they came to Jesus, they suddenly had an awareness that God cared about Israel. They didn't even really need to read that in the Bible. Just suddenly they had this weird sense that God cares about Israel. Somehow, seeking in God, you find his purposes at the same time. Just as there are many members of one body, and not everyone is an eye or a toe or a hand, so too do the nations knit together with individual calling and purpose. While studying theology, and most deliberately this is true in studying the end times, there is one question that is ignored. Out of all of the 5 W's, the why question is almost never considered. Why is it that God has purposed this? Why does God speak like this rather than in another way? Why does God reveal himself like this? To ask this is to seek God directly, because the focus is upon him and his character and his name. Without God's purpose, we are left with shallow understanding. All studying of scriptural topics must start and end here, with the character of God. Someone might have the whole Bible memorized and yet couldn't tell you one iota about what the Bible was really saying. Because it's not really about whether you have scripture memorized or not. It's about knowing the heart of God. It's about understanding his wisdom and the way that he speaks and the way that he understands things. God has revealed himself in a very specific way, choosing a very specific people, a very specific land, a very specific city, and a very specific hill in that city, within a very specific building on that hill, in that city, in that land, amongst that people, to put his name upon. Why has he gone through all the trouble of so much specificity? The answer is simple. This why question is the nub of all theology. Depending on how you answer, God's choosing tells me everything about what you will say in regard to all other aspects of theology. To say it is of grace that God chose this tells me you're probably leaning towards Calvinism and quite possibly don't even believe that there is any importance to God's choosing. Even if you do believe it, it's still to matter. To say it was for Jesus to come, then you probably believe that the church has replaced Israel and these things are all obsolete. The reason that God has placed his name upon these people, that land, that city, that hill, that temple upon that hill, his choosing might indeed be a grace, but it is because God's wisdom demands this kind of a choosing. This is the way that he desires to reveal himself, because this is what he is. It's certainly, God's wisdom is contrary to the wisdom of the principalities and powers, where they demand massive temples, grandiose rituals, and mighty people, bigger, more powerful, more intimidating. God states that the meek will inherit the earth. He tells Israel when they're going into the land that these 7 nations they're going to drive out are a people stronger and more mighty than they are. And so it's not like Israel is going to be able to take this land on their own merit, but God is giving it to them, and the land itself is going to fight for them by driving these nations out. This is the wisdom of God. This is how he decides to show himself. So we're going to end there. And next time we're going to be looking at the Table of Nations and kind of what is it that we can draw from the descendants of Noah and his sons. How does this fit into the scope of the Bible? So I hope to see you in that video. Thanks for listening to this one.